The woman known to history as Magda Goebbels was born on the 11th of November 1901 in the capital of the German Empire, Berlin. Her father was Oskar Ritschl, a prominent building contractor and engineer, and Magda's mother was Augusta Behrendt. Magda's parents were not married when she was born, and although they subsequently did marry each other, the union did not last long and they divorced before Magda was 4 years old. Consequently, she did not have any siblings growing up, and, as we will see, her younger years were considerably disrupted by her parents' divorce at a time when marital separation was still relatively uncommon. Following her parents' divorce in 1905, Magda was quickly packed off in 1906 to Cologne, the city at the heart of Germany's industrial region in the Rhineland in the west of the country. Her father had relocated there for work, and her mother seems to have been unable to support Magda and sent their only daughter to live with him there. However, this arrangement too only lasted a brief time, for in 1908 Augusta Behrendt married Richard Friedlander, a member of a family of wealthy Jewish merchants who lived in Berlin and who specialized in leather goods. Richard's family had extensive business connections throughout Western and Central Europe, and he had lived primarily in Brussels since the late 1890s. Thus, when he and Magda's mother married in 1908, they relocated to the Belgian capital. Augusta quickly requested that Magda be sent to live with her, a petition which her father assented to. Additionally, Richard Friedlander soon adopted Magda, and she took his name. Thus, the woman who would later become known as the First Lady of the Third Reich grew up with a Jewish surname. However, she was educated at the Ursuline convent at Vilvoorde near Brussels, thus ensuring that she was raised primarily as a Roman Catholic, while some have suggested that later contact with her biological father in Western Germany may have led her to inculcating some Buddhist thought, a peculiarity at a time when Asian religious and philosophical systems were considered a subject of exclusively academic inquiry in Europe, rather than anything one might adopt elements of in their own lives. Magda's youth was once again interrupted in 1914. After years of growing tensions between the great powers of Europe, war erupted in the late summer that year after a regional political crisis in the Balkans escalated into a pan-European war. It soon reached even further afield and would become known as the First World War. In Europe, it pitted Magda's native Germany, the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the Ottoman Empire against Britain, France and Russia initially, though the latter would soon be joined by Italy and the United States, tipping the balance against the Central Powers as the alliance led by the governments in Berlin and Vienna became known. Because of their German ethnicity, Magda, her mother and her adopted father were forced to leave Brussels following the outbreak of the war. Belgium had been invaded by Germany just days after the conflict erupted as a way of striking against France without having to go through the extensive French defences in eastern France. As a result, the Friedlanders returned to Berlin, though the marriage did not survive the chaos caused by this latest shift in their affairs. By the end of 1914, Augusta and Richard had divorced, and Magda was once again raised for a time by a single mother. Back in Berlin during the war, Magda became friends with Lisa Arlosarov, a member of a family of Ukrainian Jews who had migrated to Germany in 1905 following an anti-Semitic pogrom against the Jewish community in their part of what was then the Russian Empire. They eventually settled in Berlin and were ordered to stay there or face deportation as Russian-born citizens when the First World War erupted. Through Lisa, Magda would soon meet her brother Chaim, a passionate socialist and Zionist who was increasingly in favor of the idea of the Jewish people returning to the Levant and establishing a new Jewish state in Palestine. As the war was drawing to a conclusion in 1918 and it became clear that the Central Powers of Germany, Austria-Hungary and the Ottoman Empire would lose, this desire to establish a new Jewish state in a region which had formed part of the Ottoman Empire but which would now possibly become available for this Zionist project became more plausible. Eventually, in the course of the late 1910s, Chaim and Magda entered into an intimate relationship, further suggesting that Magda was not possessed of the severe anti-Semitic feelings which many Europeans were in the first half of the 20th century. While Magda was seemingly not anti-Semitic, at least not in her youth, many in Germany were, and the loss of the First World War in November 1918 provided a conduit for this anti-Semitic feeling to expand further. As the war came to an end, Germany and many other countries across Europe descended into chaos. In Germany's case, this took the shape of a number of regional insurrections to try to establish communist or ultra-nationalist governments in cities like Berlin and Munich. Many of the latter were suffused with anti-Semitic views, parties such as the German National People's Party and the German Workers' Party. They also wished to overturn the post-war settlement, much of which had been imposed on Germany by the main victors in the war, Britain and France. Far from being magnanimous in victory, the governments in London and Paris had imposed crippling terms on Germany through the Treaty of Versailles, which brought the war between their nations to an end. Not only was Germany stripped of large amounts of territory, primarily in the east, but massive war reparations payments, which would take decades to pay back, were imposed, and Germany was further reduced to a second power status by having major restrictions imposed on its military and being forced to accept the occupation of the industrialized Ruhr and Rhineland regions of Western Germany by French and Belgian troops. All of this led to several years of pronounced political unrest in Germany between 1919 and 1923, much of it driven by war veterans disillusioned by events and willing to see Germany's plight being the result of a vast conspiracy perpetuated by an alliance of Jews and communists. Magda was, however, insulated from the unrest which was striking much of Germany in the early 1920s, for in 1920 she had met Günther Quandt, a German industrialist. Quandt was nearly twice Magda's age, having been born in 1881, but he was very rich. The Quandt family acquired a number of lucrative contracts to supply the German military with uniforms and other materiel during the war, and once the conflict ended, Günther had used the capital generated during the mid-1910s to acquire stakes in a number of companies such as BMW, a car manufacturer which was originally founded in 1916 to develop airplane engines for the nascent German Air Force. He and Magda married in 1921 after a short courtship, and within a few months a son named Harold was born on the 1st of November 1921. It was, though, an ill-fated union. Magda, in her early 20s, soon drifted away from Günther, who was in his early 40s and often away from home on business. Moreover, Quandt had 2 biological children from his previous marriage and had also adopted 3 children after a deceased friend had passed. As altruistic as Günther's actions might have been, Magda resented having to suddenly raise 6 children while her husband traveled Germany and Europe. Magda and Günther's marriage continued to deteriorate in the years that followed. By the mid-1920s, she was handing over much of the responsibility for raising the children to their extensive household staff, while she engaged in a busy social life. Once the political turmoil of the early 1920s subsided in Germany, Berlin emerged as the cultural capital of the continent, and as a smart, well-educated young woman with no financial limitations, Magda was anxious to enjoy what the city had to offer. She was also soon engaged in extramarital affairs, which were relatively easy to cover up while her husband was out of town. The subterfuge could not last forever, though, given her husband's extensive business connections around Berlin. Thus, eventually in 1928, Günther learned of one of her relationships with a student nearer her own age. He promptly initiated divorce proceedings. In order to finalize the split quickly in 1929, he agreed to a large financial settlement, which effectively meant that Magda became a financially independent and newly divorced young woman at the age of 27. The divorce agreement also stipulated that Magda would raise the only biological child she had with Günther, Harold, until he was 14 years old in 1935, after which he would be sent to learn the family business under the tutelage of his father. Magda's first marriage was not the only thing which was collapsing in the late 1920s. While Germany's politics had been tortuous back in 1921 when she had married Günther, it had recovered substantially in the mid-1920s, entering a period of new prosperity and social cohesion driven by an international economic boom, one which has led economic historians to characterize the 1920s as the Roaring Twenties. As Germany's war reparations payments became manageable, the economy stabilized and people returned to work. The support that groups like the Freikorps and other ultra-nationalist organizations had enjoyed in the immediate aftermath of the First World War dried up. A sign of this was seen in one of the most prominent groups in southern Germany, the National Socialist German Workers' Party, or Nazis. These were founded in the city of Munich in Bavaria back in 1920 and had gained a substantial enough following in the area during the tumultuous years of the early 1920s. However, when they attempted an insurrection to seize control of Munich in November 1923, it failed to ignite popular support and was quickly suppressed. Moreover, when their organization was re-legalized in 1925, they could only ever obtain a minuscule vote in German national elections. The days of extremist politics seemed to have left post-war Germany. 1929 changed all of that. Right around the time that Magda's divorce from Quandt was finalized, the economic boom of the 1920s came to a crashing halt as the stock markets on Wall Street in New York City were hammered throughout the autumn. Within weeks, a seismic ripple was spreading across the Americas and Europe as economies were shaken to their core. The Great Depression, a period of several years in the early 1930s when tens of millions of people lost their jobs, their life savings, and their economic prospects, followed. Germany, which still had its massive war reparations payments to contend with, was particularly badly impacted, and as the economic damage spread, Germans began once again turning to the extremist politicians they had once viewed as plausible contenders for power 10 years earlier. Incredibly, when new Reichstag elections were held in September 1930, the Nazis increased their share of the national vote from just over 2.5% in 1928 to over 18%, making them the second largest political party in Germany. By 1931, they were growing to unprecedented heights, and every German seemed to be considering joining the Nazis or attending a party rally to see what their leader, Adolf Hitler, had to say about Germany's plight. Magda was an early convert to this new political party. She had begun taking an interest in the Nazis in the summer of 1930, attending meetings in Berlin. It was here that she first heard Joseph Goebbels, the head of the propaganda wing of the party and the regional leader of the Nazis in Berlin for several years, speak at an event. She was evidently taken by his gifts as an orator and began volunteering at Goebbels' office in the capital. Under an entry for the 7th of November 1930, Goebbels noted in his diary that Magda was reorganizing his papers in his office. He had clearly taken a liking to her, and they began casually seeing each other. But this does not appear to have turned into a committed courtship until February 1931, while talks of their possible marriage had begun by the late spring. That Easter, they visited Hitler in Bavaria, while Joseph started to try to cultivate a relationship with Magda's son from her marriage to Quandt, Harold. As their courtship developed that summer, Magda's large apartment in Berlin even became a meeting point for some of the higher-ranking members of the Nazi Party, with Hitler visiting there on occasion. It was the beginning of her entry into the world of the party, which would soon come to dominate Germany. Magda and Joseph's relationship was certainly not without its problems. As early as April 1931, ominous signs were developing. They argued regularly from the very earliest days of knowing each other. A familiar pattern emerged in this. Magda would go missing for a while, not returning his calls as she visited friends or was otherwise indisposed. Then Goebbels would become incredibly jealous and controlling. All of this was compounded as he became aware of the fact that her first marriage had come to an end on the back of Magda's infidelities. He would find it difficult in the months that followed to overlook this, and matters were not helped by the fact that Hitler himself seemed to have taken an interest in Magda after meeting her on several occasions. How much of this was real and how much of it was Goebbels' imagining is hard to say, but the relationship continued to be strained into the autumn of 1931, with his jealous outbursts creating tension. Yet these episodes were punctuated by weeks in which everything went smoothly, and in September they determined to move the date of their proposed marriage closer. Part of the reason for this, as biographers of Goebbels have noted, was that a peculiar arrangement was developing whereby Hitler was as anxious to have his propaganda chief and Magda marry as Joseph or Magda themselves were. For Hitler, whose sexual relationships were always of a peculiar nature, the couple would act as a kind of alternative first family within the Nazi hierarchy, removing the necessity of him marrying any time soon himself. Whatever the exact reasons for all this, we do know for sure that Magda and Joseph determined to marry sooner rather than later that autumn and moved the date forward to December 1931. Magda personally asked Hitler to act as the witness at their wedding, to which he agreed. Despite all this, several blazing arguments occurred between her and Joseph in the late autumn, one brought on by Joseph's discovery that Magda had been born out of wedlock, an issue which still carried a significant social stigma in the 1930s. On another occasion, Joseph was introduced to Magda's ex-husband Gunther Quandt, who had also decided to join the Nazis in the early 1930s, and whose business dealings would benefit enormously from becoming a member of the party in years to come. Goebbels expected to dislike him, but was surprised not to. Instead, a few days later, it was a few ill-thought-out words between he and Magda which triggered yet another argument. One would think that the signs were clear that the marriage should not go ahead, but Hitler wished for them to marry, and by the early winter, Magda knew that she was pregnant. And so it was that on the 19th of December, Magda and Joseph Goebbels were married at a Quandt family estate, which Magda had acquired the use of in her divorce settlement in Severin in Mecklenburg. Hitler acted as a witness, with Goebbels' sister Maria acting as a bridesmaid. Married life would prove just as tempestuous as their courtship and engagement had been. Magda and Joseph were married just as the Nazis were nearing the precipice of power in Germany. The party membership had continued to grow exponentially in 1931 and into 1932, but without fresh Reichstag elections, its new popularity could not be translated into dominance of the political system. That opportunity finally presented itself in July 1932, when new national elections were held. In these, the Nazis emerged as the largest party in the country, garnering 37% of the vote and winning 230 seats in the Reichstag. Still, the centrist parties tried to prevent their rise to power, cobbling together a minority government of technocrats. However, this could not function effectively, and as the economic situation continued to deteriorate, an impasse was reached by the start of 1933. That January, an agreement was struck amongst elements of the centre-right of the political establishment whereby Hitler would become Chancellor of Germany, and several ministerial briefs would be granted to senior Nazi political figures. The idea was for a broad coalition to try to temper and control the Nazis in government, but this proved farcical. Within weeks, Hitler, Goebbels and others monopolized power in the hands of the Nazis by engineering an artificial political emergency and using it as the basis for the passage of laws allowing them to rule by decree. By the summer of 1933, the German Republic was effectively dead, and in its place, a one-party fascist state ruled by the Nazis had emerged. The ascent of the Nazis to power in the first months of 1933 completely changed the dynamics of Magda's life. In mid-March, Joseph was appointed as Minister for Public Enlightenment and Propaganda. He was now in charge of a vast array of aspects of German life. At its heart, the ministry's goal was to indoctrinate the German people into the ideology of Nazism, with its goals of reaching back to a mythical time when the German people had been pure and immensely powerful. In order to do this, Goebbels and his officials were determined to highlight that Nazism's success was confronted by many enemies, particularly the Jewish people and the communists, who were in league with each other to try to destroy Germany. Through the Ministry of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda, Goebbels would deploy everything from radio broadcasts and films in the cinema to posters and newspaper slogans in the years ahead to try to mold the German people into Nazism's image, uniting the nation for a coming war of revenge for what had happened in the First World War. This position made Goebbels one of the most powerful figures in Germany overnight, and Magda became an influential figure herself within Berlin society as a consequence. While her husband was running the propaganda wing of the Nazi state, Magda became something of a poster woman for Nazi ideology towards women. This was backward-looking. It argued that the place of German women was in the home, raising the Aryan soldiers for the wars to come to ensure German domination of Europe. Thus, for instance, German women were precluded from working in certain sectors of society such as higher education from the mid-1930s onwards, and this was gradually expanded in the years that followed to include senior roles within the medical field, nursing excluded, and within politics. Admittedly though, it should be noted that this was hardly unique in Western society at the time, and many supposedly developed countries still did not even allow women to vote in the 1930s. However, there is no doubting that the Nazis had a regressive attitude towards women's rights. Instead of working, the idealized Nazi German woman should focus her energies on being a wife and mother, and facilitating her children's education and her husband's career. Magda was prominent in promoting this ideal. Shortly after the Nazis seized power, she stated, quote, "German women were excluded from 3 professions: the army, as elsewhere in the world, the government, and the judiciary. If a German girl must choose between marriage or a career, she will always be encouraged to marry, because that is what is best for a woman." Thus, Mrs. Goebbels became a figurehead of Nazi ideological attitudes towards women from early on in the regime's time in power. She was also considerably involved in the National Socialist Women's League. This was established in October 1931 in response to claims that the Nazis did not appeal enough to female voters. However, once the party seized power, it evolved into an instrument to promote Nazi ideological ideas concerning women's role in society. It fostered the Nazi ideological view of women and organized lectures and events to promote these. Magda appeared at many events of the League as the figurehead of the Nazi female leadership. The League also published a magazine, the National Socialist Women's Monitor, which bizarrely interspersed articles offering advice to German women on housekeeping and motherhood, with pieces designed to promote the idea of Germany acquiring new lands in Eastern Europe and the development of a Greater Germany. Magda Goebbels featured in several issues over the years. Overall, the reach of the League was extensive, with over 2 million German women being members by the late 1930s, and with the National Socialist Women's Monitor having a circulation of 1.9 million copies by that time. All of this amounted to Magda becoming a kind of pseudo-First Lady of the Third Reich during the 1930s. Many of the senior members of the Nazi regime were either not married or had home lives which did not lend themselves well to being under the public gaze. Hitler himself was a bachelor. From the time that he became Chancellor of Germany, he was involved in an increasingly committed relationship with a photographer named Eva Braun, but the relationship was strained in its own way. Braun was over 20 years younger than the Nazi leader, and she had attempted suicide at least once early on in their courtship. As such, Hitler determined not to marry her during the 1930s, and they did not have children. In the face of this, Magda was often conceived of by German society at the time as a kind of surrogate First Lady, and indeed by the late 1930s, she was the recipient of a steady stream of correspondence from women all over Germany, petitioning her on a range of matters in much the same way in which a First Lady would often be within other countries. This impression of Magda was also partly driven by the prominence which she had as a mother within the regime. The Goebbels ended up having 6 children in the first 9 years of their marriage. Magda had already been pregnant when she and Joseph were wed, and in 1932 she gave birth to their first child, a daughter named Helga. 5 more children followed, 1 son and 4 more daughters. These were Hildegard in 1934, Helmut in 1935, Holdine in 1937, Hedwig in 1938, and finally Heidrun in 1940. Each child's name started with an H, and it has been speculated, probably with complete accuracy, that Magda and Joseph elected to adopt this convention in an act of sycophancy towards Hitler, whose name started with H. As they grew up, the Goebbels children became surrogate first children within the Third Reich, in much the same way that Magda had become a pseudo-First Lady in the absence of Hitler being married. Already by 1937, Helga and Hildegard, the 2 eldest of their children, were being photographed at Nazi party events, and this tendency only increased over the years. Often it had a deeply sinister edge. For instance, in 1939, Joseph Goebbels filmed his children in a playful family scene, which was subsequently used in a Nazi propaganda video to promote the idea that handicapped or disabled children should be euthanized. Later, when the Nazis enveloped Europe in war, the Goebbels children were used dozens of times per year in films and photo opportunities to show how normal life was continuing in Germany, despite the conflict in France and Eastern Europe. Throughout these years, as they were rising to become the face of Nazi family values, Joseph and Magda were also benefiting financially from his rise to power. On top of his ministerial salary and other prerequisites, Goebbels received an extensive allowance from the Nazi Party, which Hitler had personally sanctioned. This allowed them to finance the purchase of a large mansion in the exclusive suburb of Wannsee outside Berlin. By 1936, a motorboat, a Mercedes sports car, and a limousine had been added to the mix. Then Joseph sold the future contract rights to publish his extensive diaries to the Nazi Party's publishing house, Air Verlag. The contract stipulated these would be published 20 years after his death, in return for which Goebbels received a one-off payment of 250,000 Reichsmarks and 100,000 marks every year thereafter. With all of this newfound wealth, Magda was able to begin ostentatiously decorating the villa in Wannsee, and the house became the scene of many lavish parties held for the Nazi top brass in the capital from the mid-1930s onwards. A summer home on the riverine island of Schwanenwerder, not far from Berlin, was also acquired, while in addition Joseph acquired a smaller house in the capital. In time, other homes were acquired elsewhere across Germany. The family needed for nothing when it came to their children and enjoyed the robust trappings of wealth which Joseph's position afforded them following the Nazis' seizure of power. Yet all was not marital bliss. The primary reason why Joseph obtained a second house in Berlin was to use it for his very many extramarital affairs, a large number of which were with the actresses who were employed in his propaganda films. One in particular became a cause of scandal. In 1937, Joseph began seeing Lida Barova, a Czech actress who had moved to Berlin a few years earlier. By this time, the fights which had punctuated the Goebbels relationship at regular intervals from before they were ever even married had begun to weigh on both parties, and often when he was home from his admittedly extensive work commitments, he and Magda would sit in silence, rather than risk the possibility of a new argument. Magda was not innocent herself in any of this, and she had also had an affair with a zealous Nazi, Kurt Lüdecker, in 1933. Before he fled Germany shortly afterwards, having come under suspicion by the party for his links to the leadership of the SA, the paramilitary wing of the Nazis, whose top figures were purged in 1934. These affairs were problematic, but when Joseph started seeing Barova, he went so far as to be seen in public with her. For one of the country's senior ministers, it wasn't long before word of this got around, and Magda became aware of what was happening. When she did, she turned to Hitler for help, and on the 15th of August 1938 met with him to discuss the situation at length. The following day, the Führer had a meeting with Joseph, whereat he demanded that he end the affair. But, in a rare act of defiance, Goebbels didn't do so, despite agreeing to. Things only became more strained thereafter. When Kurt Hanke, one of Goebbels' senior staff members, became caught up in the quarrel between his superior and his wife, Magda and he ended up having a brief affair themselves. By the late autumn, Hitler had decided to make a dramatic intervention. He effectively put Hanke on leave and sent him away from Berlin, while he had the secret police, including the Gestapo, start following Barova constantly around the capital. By the end of the early winter, she was so disturbed by this that she stopped making public appearances and fled back to Prague a few weeks later. To smooth over public opinion, a family photo of the Goebbels and their children, with Hitler standing between Magda and Joseph, was taken in October 1938 and widely distributed. The idea was clear. The perfect first family was healed once again, but the reality was far different. From the winter of 1938 onwards, Magda and Joseph were increasingly distant from one another. He was often away from Berlin for work, and when he was there, she often retreated to various houses which they had acquired elsewhere in Germany, or to rural spas to recuperate from a number of serious health problems which were plaguing her, not least owing to the stress of 6 pregnancies in less than 10 years. Thus, while the scandal of Joseph's relationship with Barbara had abated, Magda's marriage to Joseph could never be said to have been a happy one thereafter. Not that it ever had been, although the public image said otherwise. While Magda and Joseph's relationship was declining to new lows, Nazi Germany was beginning an inexorable drift towards war. A war of revenge to reverse the outcome of the First World War was always a central aim of the Nazis from the very inception of their movement in the early 1920s. Once they seized power in 1933, they began preparing for this eventuality. Firstly, the country began to remilitarize extensively from early 1935 onwards, when Hitler and other senior figures within the German armed forces, the Wehrmacht, made it clear that they intended to begin conscripting in the region of 500,000 soldiers. This was a clear and egregious breach of the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, which had brought the First World War to an end, and which stipulated that Germany henceforth was to restrict its armed forces to 100,000 men. Additionally, Hermann Göring announced the creation of a new air force known as the Luftwaffe, which was also a direct violation of the Treaty of Versailles. Finally, in the spring of 1936, the German armed forces moved into the Rhineland, which had been demilitarized since the mid-1920s when French and Belgian occupying forces had left the region. By this time, Hitler and his closest allies such as Goebbels were beginning to consider that they might bring forward the proposed start date of a new European war from the early 1940s to sometime in the late 1930s. The spring of 1938 witnessed a rapid escalation of the aggressive Nazi foreign policy. Part of Nazi ideology centered on the creation of a Greater Germany, one which would necessarily include the German-speaking and ethnically German peoples of Austria and parts of Czechoslovakia and Poland. Indeed, as soon as the Nazis had seized power in Berlin in 1933, they had begun actively seeking to overthrow the far-right Austrian nationalist regime in Austria. Eventually, this culminated in a campaign of massive public pressure on Austria in the spring of 1938, aimed at forcing the government in Vienna into accepting a union with Germany. Magda would have been preoccupied by this, as Joseph's work in late 1937 and into 1938 focused increasingly on leading the propaganda drive to accept the Anschluss, or union of the two countries, one which was finally completed in March 1938 when German tanks rolled into Vienna and succeeded in bloodlessly forcing through a referendum on the matter. In the months that followed, propaganda efforts switched to the Sudetenland region of Czechoslovakia, a region in the west of the country where the majority of people were German-speaking. When an international conference was convened in Munich that September to decide on the fate of the Sudetenland, Joseph and Magda remained in Berlin. But Joseph's wave of propaganda videos released from the capital as Hitler was overseeing the conference did much to galvanize public opinion in support of the annexation of Sudetenland. A few days later, the British and French capitulated as Germany continued to expand to dominate Central Europe without ever firing a shot. In the weeks that followed the Munich conference and the annexation of the Sudetenland, Magda was privy to Joseph writing a new book rapidly. The proposed title was Adolf Hitler, a Man Who Is Making History, and the propaganda minister intended for it to be published in 1939, but it was blocked, presumably by Hitler himself, who did not wish for it to appear. While Magda would have been surprised to see her husband's efforts in this respect frustrated, there was no doubt that Hitler was to go on to make history in all the wrong ways in 1939. Unsatisfied with the Sudetenland, the Nazis effectively invaded Czechoslovakia in the spring of that year and carved it up into different occupied territories which effectively became part of the growing Third Reich. By now, Britain and France, who had insisted at Munich that there could be no further land concessions to Germany, were beginning to rearm in preparation for a war with the Nazis, which was now inevitable. They did not launch it following the annexation of Czechoslovakia, but when the familiar claims on a neighbour's territories emerged in the weeks that followed concerning Poland, both London and Paris made it clear that any breach of the Eastern European nation's sovereignty would also effectively be a declaration of war by Berlin on the Western European nations. Thus, when Hitler ordered the German military over the eastern border into Poland on the 1st of September 1939, Britain and France responded by declaring war on Germany 2 days later. The Second World War had commenced. Magda and Joseph continued to benefit from their close relationship with Hitler in the early stages of the war. Joseph's propaganda was especially necessary on the home front in 1939 and 1940, as the Nazi regime sought to galvanize the German people in support of the war effort and depict Germany's enemies as constituting an existential threat, and in some strange way the aggressor in the conflict. Magda was happy to make public appearances in line with the continuing perception of her as the leading female figure within the regime. Her and Joseph's marriage remained icy throughout this period. Following Hitler's intervention during the crisis of 1938, the marriage developed largely into one of convenience. By 1940, they had 6 children together. Both benefited enormously from a material standpoint from being in the Führer's good graces, and once they accepted that Hitler would not tolerate any further public infidelities or any possibility of them divorcing each other, the pair accepted a kind of muted marriage arrangement. Indeed, in Joseph's diaries, there is a marked decline in the references to arguments and fights between himself and Magda from the late 1930s onwards. Thus, once both accepted the situation, a curious calm seems to have settled over the relationship, one which had never been there previously, even during their courtship. While Magda's marriage to Joseph continued to oscillate between periods of stability and major tension, Germany's fortunes in the war, which it had cast Europe into in the autumn of 1939, could not have been more positive. Poland had been quickly overrun and conquered in the course of September and early October 1939. Thereafter, the Nazis had prepared for a swift conquest of Western Europe in 1940, but even Hitler was surprised at the speed with which his tank divisions and land troops were able to conquer the Low Countries and France in May and June of 1940. Denmark and Norway had already been swiftly occupied through targeted military operations in the spring, so that by the late summer of 1940, only Britain stood against Nazi Germany in Europe. It too might have been conquered if the Nazis had continued with their air and naval bombardment of the country, which was initiated in the autumn of that year. But early in 1941, Hitler became determined to switch his attentions eastwards and initiate a war with Nazism's great ideological enemy, the Bolshevik Communists of the Soviet Union. In the summer of 1941, Operation Barbarossa, the largest land invasion in military history, involving 3 million German soldiers, commenced, and it proved enormously successful to begin with. By the early winter of 1941, German divisions had advanced to near Moscow and Leningrad. There was now a real possibility that the war would end in Nazi domination of the continent of Europe. As all of this was occurring, Magda took on a leading role as a symbol of how Nazi women at home in Germany should behave while their husbands and sons were fighting on the fronts or leading the war effort from military headquarters elsewhere. For instance, she trained as a Red Cross nurse shortly after the war began and appeared in many photo opportunities in the months that followed to emphasize this role. Much was also made of the fact that her eldest child, her son Harold from the marriage to Günther Quandt, was serving as a pilot in the Luftwaffe. Moreover, because Hitler was not married to his partner Eva Braun, and it was consequently not appropriate given the standards of the time for her to entertain visiting dignitaries and heads of state and their wives, the responsibility for doing so often fell to Magda and the Goebbels. This was a time-consuming endeavor in the early 1940s as the new heads of puppet regimes and vassal states which had been created across Europe were required to travel to Berlin and bend the knee, figuratively speaking, to the Nazi leaders in the capital of the Reich. A much more controversial issue concerned the Nazi states' changing attitudes towards the Reich's Jewish population and how Magda responded to this. When the Nazis seized power in 1933, there were approximately 500,000 Jews living in Germany. This was a relatively small percentage of the overall population, and the favored policy of the party during the remainder of the 1930s was to make life as uncomfortable as possible for these 500,000 German Jews, with the ultimate goal of forcing them to leave the country. Thus, under the Nuremberg laws, Jews in Germany were broadly robbed of their citizenship and an immense amount of rights,
Pogroms followed, and violence and indiscriminate arrests of Jews in the country were escalating massively in 1938 and 1939. And then, things went even further. A huge proportion of Europe's Jews lived in Poland in the 1930s, over 3 million. Consequently, after the annexation of Poland in the opening months of the war, more extreme attitudes began to develop, and by the summer of 1941, it had been decided by Hitler and others that a policy of mass murder or genocide would be initiated. Millions of Jews from across the Reich were to be detained and transported to a series of death camps in Poland and surrounding regions, and there they would be gassed to death. The Holocaust of Europe's Jews would eventually result in the death of approximately 6 million people.
As the wife of one of the most senior figures within the Nazi regime, Magda cannot but have been aware of what was now unfolding in Poland and elsewhere. There is a striking element to all of this when we consider her background. Magda had been raised for several years in her youth as an adopted daughter of Richard Friedlander, while she had also briefly dated Chaim Arlosoroff, a leading Jewish Zionist, in her youth. She seems not to have been possessed of any anti-Semitic feeling herself, and once, when asked about the persecution of the Jewish people by the Nazi regime, she simply stated that it was Hitler's wish and that her husband had to go along with it, although this was a complete distortion of Joseph Goebbels' own committed anti-Semitism. But what is striking is that Magda did very little to intervene to save the lives of any Jewish people she had known. She might possibly have provided anonymous aid to the Franks family, who had themselves provided help to Magda and her mother way back in 1914 when they were travelling to Berlin from Brussels after they had been deported from Belgium at the start of the First World War. But for her former adoptive father, Richard Friedlander, she did nothing. She had ceased to have any contact with him years earlier. He was eventually arrested and is believed to have perished in a Nazi concentration camp in 1939. In many ways, the Holocaust was initiated because the Nazis had come to believe that victory in the war was now inevitable. The endless succession of striking military victories, which occurred between September 1939 and the autumn of 1941, had convinced Hitler and his acolytes that they would soon be triumphant across Europe. Then they would have no one to answer to for their genocidal approach to the Jews. But this hubris was soon countered. Even as the final plans for the Holocaust were being put in place, the war in Russia was beginning to turn against the Germans. That winter, the Nazi armies failed to take Moscow and Leningrad, and slowly the full might of the Soviet Union was mobilized against the German invasion. In tandem, the United States entered the war on the side of Britain and the Soviet Union in December 1941, following an unprovoked attack on the American Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii by Nazi Germany's ally, the Empire of Japan. Faced with this combined alliance, the war effort began to turn in 1942, and by early 1943 had shifted dramatically. That spring and summer, the Russians turned the tide and started pushing the Germans back into Ukraine and Poland, while the Western Allies opened a southern front in Sicily after winning the battle for control of North Africa. Moreover, the United States had agreed that victory over Nazi Germany in Europe would take priority over the campaign in the Pacific against the Empire of Japan. It was all very ominous for the Nazi regime. As this succession of reverses occurred from the winter of 1941 onwards, Magda's relationship with Hitler and the Nazi cause in general entered a period of contradictory fluxes. On the one hand, for her, as for so many others in Germany, the sheen of invincibility that had once surrounded the Führer and the Nazi mission in the early stages of the war had very much been tarnished. The best efforts of her husband's propaganda machine aside, on more than one occasion she was seen to be openly dismissive of Hitler's views and statements while at social events in Berlin, while in 1944 she was willing to state in public that the Nazi leader had become delusional in many of his views on the war. A dangerous statement to make in public in an authoritarian state where secret police were everywhere. But by then, Magda had her reasons for some personal bitterness at the war situation. Her eldest child from her first marriage, Harold, had been captured while fighting against the Allied invasion of Italy and was being held in a prisoner of war camp from which he would not be released until 1947. Magda
would never see him again. Yet, in stark contrast to these more negative sentiments, were occasions on which Magda could display a zealous commitment to the Nazi cause. When Joseph gave a famous speech at the Sportpalast in Berlin on the 18th of February 1943, in which he had whipped up the crowd and asked them fervently if they wanted total war, Magda dutifully attended with their two eldest children, Helga and Hildegard. Moreover, whatever her misgivings in private might have been, she continued to visit Hitler regularly when he was in Berlin, and remained one of his closest female confidants. All in all, her response to the declining war situation and towards Hitler was changeable and difficult to decipher.
If Magda did have a growing disillusionment with Hitler, then it was not unfounded. By 1944, the Führer was an increasingly delusional figure, one who rejected the sound strategic thinking of many of his generals in favor of dubious military strategies he favored himself. He continued to cling to the ideological belief that the Western Allies would soon have a major falling out with the Soviet leader Joseph Stalin and his ministers. Once this occurred, Hitler reasoned, Britain and the US would find common cause against the Bolsheviks and Communists of the Soviet Union. This never occurred. Instead, in the summer of 1944, the Western Allies finally opened a Western Front in northern France, which Stalin had long requested them to do, in order to draw German forces away from Eastern Europe, with three fronts now operating on the continent, one in Eastern Europe, one in Italy, and one in France. The Nazis began to rapidly relinquish control of the lands they had conquered since 1939. By the spring of 1945, the British, Americans, Canadians, and French were spreading out across Western Germany, occupying the Rhineland. But it was the Russians, who had moved over the River Elbe in northeastern Germany, which were the more pressing issue for families like the Goebbels. In the late spring of 1945, having surrounded Berlin, they began the last battle to take the German capital. Many senior Nazis contemplated fleeing Berlin at this point, but Magda and Joseph Goebbels ensconced themselves in the center of the city with Hitler.
As the Allies entered Germany, the Goebbels had removed their children from one of their country estates to Schwanenwerder Villa outside Berlin. From there, the sound of artillery and bombings could soon be heard far off in the distance, and the children were brought into Berlin itself. On the 22nd of April, as the Red Army was massing around Berlin and entering the main suburbs, the 6 children were brought to the Führerbunker in the center of the city, a bunker below the Reich Chancellery. This was effectively the command center of what was left of the Third Reich. Hitler and his main staff had moved in here in January 1945. By late April, it had become a desperate place where a somber Hitler received final visits from some of the most senior Nazi Party members. In many instances, he merely dismissed them, asserting that they had failed him. However, the Goebbels were not amongst these. Zealously, Magda and Joseph were to remain here underground in central Berlin with the Führer until the very end. For his loyalty, Hitler changed the order of succession in a completely futile gesture, appointing Goebbels as his successor and renouncing Hermann Göring, who it had long been understood would succeed should Hitler die.
What followed in the last days of April and the 1st of May are relatively well known in the broad sense, but why they occurred with regard to the Goebbels family is perhaps less understood. Hitler had determined to take his own life rather than falling into the hands of the Soviet Union. Joseph Goebbels seemingly had a similar view, and in a cryptic message he had broadcast on German radio in late February 1945, he seems to have alluded to the idea that his children's lives would not be worth living if the Nazi cause perished. On the 15th of April, as the noose tightened on Berlin, he had published an article in the paper Das Reich, in which he again questioned if life would be worth living when the Third Reich finally fell. Thus, it appears that, for months leading up to the siege of Berlin, Joseph had been contemplating the possibility of suicide if the miracle of a falling out between the Allies did not occur and the Nazi regime was completely defeated. Whether he had discussed this or not with Magda is also unknown, but she herself seemingly alluded to plans to commit suicide and for her and Joseph to kill their children in the process in the final weeks of the war. Moreover, when several senior figures within the regime offered to help smuggle the children out of Berlin, Magda refused all offers. All of this suggests a plan which, while it might not have been entirely committed to, was at least premeditated and thought out as a possible option if the worst should happen. Whatever the motives or the background might have been, we do know precisely what did occur. As artillery bombardments were heard ever closer to central Berlin, and as the Führerbunker began to shake from explosions above, Hitler decided to marry his long-term partner Eva Braun on the night of the 29th of April. The following day, the Nazi leader and his bride committed suicide. For a brief time, Magda's husband now became the leader of the Third Reich as German Chancellor. His tenure of that office is really remembered for only one event in which Magda was the central protagonist. On the 1st of May, the 6 Goebbels children, Helga, who was 12 years old, Hildegard, who was 11, 9-year-old Helmut, 8-year-old Holdine, and Hedwig and Heidrun, who were just 6 and 4 years old respectively, were killed. Exactly how this occurred has been a matter of extensive debate. Some accounts later held that an SS dentist, Helmut Krünz, injected each of the children with morphine and that cyanide capsules were then crushed in their mouths once they had lost consciousness. Others suggest that Hitler's physician in his last weeks, Ludwig Stumpfegger, gave the children morphine or some other sedative in sweetened drinks, and they were then killed once this had an effect. But what is usually agreed is that it was Magda Goebbels who killed 6 of her 7 children on the 1st of May 1945, most likely by administering cyanide herself. Thereafter, Magda and Joseph proceeded upstairs to the garden of the Reich Chancellery where they committed suicide. They appear to have swallowed cyanide pills and left orders with the SS guards with them that once the poison started to take effect, they were to shoot them, repeatedly if necessary. Their bodies were then doused in petrol and set alight. Just a day later, Soviet troops entered the Reich Chancellery and found the charred remains of Magda and her husband still lying in the garden. The SS members there had apparently ignored orders to bury their remains once they had burned their corpses. The surface of the Reich Chancellery building was secured that afternoon, and so it was not until the 3rd of May that Russian troops went down into the Führerbunker and discovered the 6 children lying dead in their beds, dressed in their nightclothes with ribbons in their hair. Their bodies were taken away for autopsy. It remains unclear to this day where or if they were buried by the Soviet authorities. The location of the remains of Magda and Joseph is also unknown. They, like those of several others from the bunker, were buried and exhumed again, several times over in the months that followed, as the Soviet leader Joseph Stalin appears to have changed his mind repeatedly about what should be done with them. As with their children, it is unclear where the remains of Magda and Joseph were buried or their final ashes deposited. Magda Goebbels was one of the most prominent figures involved in the Nazi regime. Having become interested in the party in 1930 in the aftermath of her first divorce, she quickly became involved with Joseph Goebbels and by 1931 was considering marriage to him. But the relationship was tempestuous from the beginning, and when they married in December of that year, it seemed as much at the behest of Hitler than out of any real desire to wed. The rise of the Nazis to power brought social status and wealth. Outwardly to German society, the Goebbels were the epitome of the perfect German family in the new Germany, with their brood of Aryan children and seemingly picture-perfect life. Furthermore, in the absence of Hitler having a wife, Magda became a surrogate first lady, appearing regularly in Nazi propaganda, often with her children. But behind the facade was a deeply troubled marriage, one in which both Magda and Joseph engaged in a string of affairs. When one of these became a potential source of scandal in 1938, Hitler intervened and made it clear that divorce was out of the question. In that sense, it was an unusual poster first family.
Magda's ideological approach to Nazism was just as contradictory. Here was a woman who had been partially raised by an adoptive Jewish father, who had dated a Jewish man in her youth, and who was clearly not possessed of much anti-Semitism, who in the 1930s nevertheless became the unofficial First Lady of the most anti-Semitic government to ever exist. Her attitude towards Hitler and the war could be similarly ambivalent. criticizing the Führer in front of friends, but acting as one of his closest female confidants at the same time. But most inexplicable of all was the perverse loyalty she displayed towards Hitler in the final days of the conflict. Rather than escaping with her 6 children from Berlin, which she could have done, she elected to bring them to Hitler's bunker. And on the 1st of May, the day after Hitler committed suicide, Magda Goebbels murdered her 6 children aged between 12 and 4 years of age before she and Joseph killed themselves. For Joseph, there can have been no hope of any fate other than arrest, trial and execution in the aftermath of the war. But Magda would have probably escaped with a few years in jail, while her children were not guilty of any crimes. As such, her heinous act at the last moment was born not of necessity, but out of the fanatical and inexplicable loyalty which so many Germans developed towards Hitler and the Nazi cause.
What do you think of Magda Goebbels? How can the contradictions in her personality and her decision to kill her own children be explained? Please let us know in the comment section, and in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.